Welcome back to another episode of the Warbird Mistress. I want to start off by thanking my Patreon patrons for their contributions. Every little bit helps, of course, and if you'd like to help out, check out the link in the description. I also want to thank Kevin Thompson for his beautiful scale models. Those in this presentation are his babies, and he is an amazing aviation historian, a great friend, and quite the artist with the lovely scale models you'll be seeing. So now on to the fun. When Japan went to war with the Allies on 7 December 1941, little was known about the state of Japanese aviation. In fact, the 1940, 1941, and 1942 editions of the FM 30-38 and the Navy's equivalent handbooks were hardly different from civilian books and were loaded with guesswork, aircraft that didn't exist, and plenty of blank spaces. For example, the Mitsubishi A5M Claude, which had first fought in China from Japanese carriers, was thought to still be the primary Japanese naval fighter. The manuals and short films used to identify the Claude couldn't even agree on the shape. Then there's this aircraft. Was it an Army Air Service Claude or a new aircraft? Or did it really look like this? Or is this the Type 97, right? The new one? And was it this fighter with the inverted gull wing? Well, it was clearly seen in action, wasn't it? This lack of insight would lead to the establishment of tactical air intelligence units in each region beginning in November 42. Code names for Japanese aircraft had already begun to be assigned by the spring of that year. These would be the code names that would become famous in the annals of air warfare. The Ione, Ben, Joe, Gus, Omar. Those, you don't know those? Well, that's odd. Maybe it's because they didn't really exist. Two even came straight from as reputable an intelligence source as one could hope to have. Pre-war Japanese comic books. Publications for the public like these and those for the military as well were a little different and relied heavily on trade publications' reports of Japanese aircraft and newspaper photographs. Many of the errors were simply cases of mistaken identity. This is the Aichi Type 98, aside the code name Ione. 3 770 Aichi motors and a heavy armament of 237mm cannon and 4 machine guns? While the description says that very little has been seen of this machine in action and it is probably produced in very small quantities, it was in fact a very widely known aircraft, and there's illustrations to prove it, of course. Except it's really the Italian Cant Z506. It had been discussed in several Japanese magazines prior to the war, and that was enough to make the Ione maritime bomber. The Ione was not based on the Cant Z506, she was the Cant Z506, and was not in Japanese service at all. Not all were cases of mistaken identity, however. This may appear to be a French all-purpose 1930s Amiot or Potez design, but it really is a Japanese bomber. She's a Mitsubishi Kai-2-2 of 1933. That makes it a Type 93, not a Type 98, and it was long out of service. There's also this Mitsubishi, or is it a Nakajima? This is the Eve bomber, also known as Ava. Looks a mite like the Bf-110 even. In reality, it's just the demilitarized version of the very same Mitsubishi we just covered. It was made as a record breaker for the Asahi Shimbun newspaper. In fact, you could see the eponymous Morning Sun logo of the paper right there on the fuselage. The Eve never existed, but the design was developed into a line of heavy fighters which would have been valuable heavy fighters for the Japanese as the war progressed, had any of them left the drawing board. These images, by the way, are from Edwin M. Dyer III's Japanese Secret Projects, an excellent volume that I recommend. Now that's the Kogi-Ken Plan 1 Type A long-range heavy fighter on top there, and the further development Kogi-Ken Plan 5 revised light bomber below. Now between these are the Plan 2 and Plan 3, which were radical departures for Japan. These interesting-looking light bomber designs were never known to the Allies during the war. One can only imagine what Allied air intel would have made of them. That doesn't mean that there weren't equally strange creations that the Allies did believe to be in service. This, for example, is the Type TK.19 fighter, codenamed Joe. If it doesn't look familiar, that's perfectly fine. It was seen in pre-war Japanese magazine discussing futuristic designs. When the origin was discovered, the Joe was taken from TAIU lists. The Gus looks much more realistic. The streamlined design and contra-rotating props certainly look intimidating. In fact, that was likely on the mind of the designer who had decided to publish his pre-war idea of his ideal aircraft in the same Sora magazine article as the Joe. It was reprinted in English in the December 1941 issue of Flight. The Japanese had purposely let Western media believe it was a real creation by including it in comics and trade magazines that would be picked up by the Western media. The 12-cylinder inline steam-cooled engine that gave the heavily armored Gus a top speed of 410 miles per hour seemed not out of the realm of possibilities. With the somewhat similar appearance to the Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony, it was not out of the imaginations of Allied officers who were still in shock from the gaps in their knowledge Pearl Harbor had brought to the surface. In fact, this was the one design from the realms of fancy which did make it into reality. The Ki-64 Rob was a prototype single-seat heavy fighter with 2 contra-rotating propellers and evaporative cooling. License-built Daimler-Benz DB601A 12-cylinder liquid-cooled inverted V aircraft engines built under contract as the Ha-40, the same motor that powered the Tony, were set up in tandem in an arrangement dubbed the Ha-201, and the wing surfaces were used as a radiator surface for engine coolant. She reached 430 miles per hour and was to carry 4 20mm guns. The Gus, in a roundabout way, was real, albeit only in a single example. The Suzukaze 20 Omar is another of Japan's April 1941 Dreams of Future Designers article, which in a way did reach reality. Armed with cannon and with a streamlined design that would put the cockpit in the vertical stabilizer, it was certainly unique. This frightening and foreign visage was not to be seen over the Pacific, but she was not as unique as some might imagine, as similar designs were being fielded by the Lippisch brothers, albeit as gliders until 1944, when plans for a ramjet-powered interceptor were made. She also had a heritage of sorts in Japanese native designs. In 1938, the joint French-Japanese project, the Mitsubishi Payan PA400, was developed from the idea and given the stamp of approval from the government. Payan would refuse to cooperate, however, and withdraw support as the shadow of war seemed threateningly close. The poor visibility, lack of radial engines of sufficient power, and end of French cooperation were bad enough for the design, but the Japanese Navy was not interested in something radical and unorthodox anyway. They were highly conservative and trusted in the capabilities of pilots to make all the difference, only fueling their pilot shortage by continually intensifying training requirements. American experts did wonder, however, if this design actually had made it past the imaginations of aircraft companies' ingénues. It does favor the Kyushu J7W Shinden, don't you think? The more traditional designs that they favored included the Nate, Oscar, Claude, the Zeke, or this thing, the Abdul. The Americans believed that the Army and Navy both used a development of the Nate, albeit with retractable gear. It is interesting that they are so confident about the propeller design, considering the Abdul never existed. Even if it were a mistaken Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar, a design that had entered service in October 41 and was frequently mistaken for the infamous Type 0 by pilots in China who had only heard of the Zeke, the Oscar was already known to Allied forces. This is merely one of the Ki-27B Nates, shown on the left. This was the most produced version, with 1,492 examples, compared to the earlier Ki-27A, of which 565 had been built. What looks like semi-recessed fuel tanks were 30-gallon drop tanks. There was no example with retractable gear, and the cockpit was always enclosed, even if flying with it in an open position was hardly unknown. In fact, there were very minor external differences between the A and B models, limited mostly to an improved cockpit, and it had never served in the Navy. This is an example of over-reporting by American pilots and ground observers, and the confusion that reigned over the Pacific, especially as the Nate had been completely withdrawn after the Philippines from service against the Allies, and was only used as a trainer. However, the Nate continued to be used by Thai and Manchurian forces in the China-Burma-India theater, where the Abdul was reported. The error was soon noticed, however, and the Nate name was applied universally. The same can be said of the Mitsubishi Type 97, which was also believed to serve in both the Army and Navy, also had semi-recessed fuel tanks, and was, quote, known to have been in service in China. Although the wing and canopy resemble the Oscar, the tail is notably different. However, in my own opinion, it may have been the Ki-44 Tojo that was seen. The Tojo did not formally enter service until 1942, but had first flown in 1940, and began operational tests out of Saigon-occupied French Indochina, with the 47th Chutai Kawasami Buntai in December 1941, and was assigned to the occupied Netherlands East Indies in 1942. Another case of mistaken identity may be the Ben. Allegedly the Nagoya Sento Ki-001 carrier fighter, it was reported by 5th Air Force Intelligence in 1942. While often considered a figment of imagination, you couldn't tell me that it isn't possibly a case of mistaken identity. After all, it seems clear that this is taken from a photo of the Mitsubishi J2M Jack, which first flew in March of 42 and entered service in December 42, especially when the grainy nature of the original photo is taken into account. The stocky final product differed from the sleek aerodynamic prototype, but a misidentification seems more likely than an overactive imagination, especially as the Jack had yet to be identified by the TAIUs. Simpler errors were such as this one, the Yokosuka B4Y Jean mistaken for a Nakajima model. albeit with the proper year of 1936. Of course, the description has to include the unusual accusation of copying foreign designs. While RAF designs were being funneled to the Japanese thanks to William de Lord Semple through clear to 1941, that did not mean the Japanese were incapable of their own designs, and the Jean was noticed as being a unique Yokosuka creation that happened to reflect contemporary designs. The government and civilian sources thought that the Japanese were incapable of innovation without foreign cooperation. As Japan had been playing copycat to the world since the Nara period, this was not an unfair assessment of cultural tendencies. However, there was no widespread adoption of foreign designs since Sopwith and Gloucester left the drawing boards of the Japanese Navy in the mid-30s. Of these 12, 7 were never in Japanese service, especially the Consolidated 28, aka PBY Catalina, a dangerous addition to a list of enemy aircraft. The DC-3, Fiat BR-20, and Lockheed Model 14 Super Electra did serve Japan as the Showa Nakajima L-2D Tabby, the Yishiki or I-type Ruth, and the Kawasaki Ki-56 Thalia or civilian Toby. Only a single DC-2 was in Japan, but the derivative Nakajima Ki-34 Thora was frequently mistaken for the larger DC-2. The Seversky 2PA was called the A8V in Japanese service and was the co-developed two-seater meant to accompany the single-seat P-35. It had been sold to Japan and Sweden, while the U.S. and her Philippine Commonwealth both fielded the single-seat P-35, along with 50 two-seaters impressed as the AT-12 Guardsmen that had been seized on their way to Sweden, as this one shown in my own photo. The Japanese examples were not liked by their pilots whatsoever. It was already obsolescent, but they were thought to be still in service by the Americans. Perhaps the Japanese would have enjoyed the fact that it was codenamed the Dick. Today the only example that survives is at Planes of Fame in Chino. Manuals of Japanese aircraft also had plenty of examples of errors in conflation, like this Type 1 Navy fighter. Somewhere between a Zeke and an Oscar, this is almost certainly a case of confused reports. What is amusing is that it somehow flew at 387 miles per hour. Moving on, the military field manual has no photo of a Type 0 Mitsubishi that had tricycle landing gear and a top speed of 350 miles per hour, so these imaginary high-performance fighters certainly got around. Even the Japanese Army had the Mitsubishi Century fighter, with incredible range, high speed, twin cannons, and no illustration. It is very likely that this was the Mitsubishi Ki-46 Dyna, as it was first flown in 1939 and was not unknown to Allied forces after it entered service in 1941. And particularly as her Shiki designation was the Type 100 Command Reconnaissance Aircraft, rather than Type 0. As the Ki-46-3 was an interceptor and entered service in 1942, at a time when she was notably immune from interception, this is likely what was meant. The Nakajima 1941 program fighter was one example of a report of an advanced design that was not really out of line. Its 387 mile-per-hour top speed, powerful motor, and heavy armament of 2 cannon and 4 machine guns never did exist, but it might have been picked up from reports of Nakajima's Ki-62 design. While it never left the drawing board, it was used as a stepping stone to the Ki-84 Frank, which would be an excellent fighter. An odd redundancy case, though, is the Nakajima Type 97 fighter, which resembles the Mitsubishi Type 96 A5M Claude in nearly every way except the clipped wings, and is reported to have identical performance specifications. This appeared in trade journals and spotters' guides, but received no code name nor publication in the official field manuals. What was in the manuals was the Vultee V-11. Assigned the code name Millie, there is no evidence she was ever in Japanese service, let alone produced by Japan. She was, however, in Chinese service as a light bomber. The error had come from Vultee giving the Japanese the right to produce the bomber, although they never took up the opportunity and reports of it in service were mistaken. Poor reporting also led to aircraft such as the Julia, known as the Type 97 Heavy Bomber or a Kawa 95 from observations in China in the months before Pearl Harbor. It was in reality merely the Kawasaki Ki-48 Lily, a light bomber. The Japanese fighter codenamed Mike in Allied intelligence manuals, and better known to the world as the Messerschmitt Bf-109, was likely the result of the early reports of the Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony, which was outfitted with the license-built DB601 motor. Funny enough, Intel manuals note, resembles Hurricane. Although it is worth noting that the prototype for the Ki-61 and the Ki-60 did look remarkably different. It may have confused intelligence further, as, in my opinion, it resembled almost a Yugoslav Rogožarski IK-3 more than a Messerschmitt design. Then there's the Atom, or a Nakajima SKT-97, Seaplane Fighter Type 97. This never existed. It was very likely inspired by the Kawanishi Experimental 8Shi Reconnaissance Seaplane, or E-8K-1. With the earlier E-7K ELF biplane in service, it was understandable that the Atom really had taken its place. Likewise, the Bob was not in service at all either. The alleged Kawanishi Type 97 fighter was not from 1937. It was the Nakajima E-2N Recon floatplane that had been replaced in 1931 and 1932. It was hardly a floatplane fighter of the late 30s. However, the Mitsubishi F-1M Pete was used as a base and convoy defense fighter, and although there's no resemblance really between the 1920s short and ferry influenced Bob and the radial engine single float Pete's 1936 design, the error is not unreasonable. The Harry, however, had no foundation in reality except in Sora magazine and model airplane circulars and a couple of comics. The U.S. Navy described it as based on the Fokker D-23, and the similarity is unmistakable, except that the D-23 existed. The Fred should look familiar, though. Well, who hasn't heard of an FW-190? Except the Japanese. They didn't get an example till 1943, though, and only one. Same with the Irene, better known as the Stuka, or Janice, better known as the U-88. There's also the Army Type 1 light bomber, codenamed Joyce. It existed in Japanese service, but was actually the Hickory light transport and never carried a weapon. Unlike the Doris, which was likely a Bennett BTC commercial aircraft whose photos had ended up in a Japanese publication. While Tactical Air Intelligence would get their act together by 1943, it was a rough going in those early months of the war. Nobody knew how the allegedly backwards, uninventive Japanese had managed to build the aircraft that they were facing. Come the end of the war, TAIU would be just as shocked as they were in 1941 by what lay behind the fog of war. Well, that's all for today. I'm so glad you took a little break to enjoy another Warbird Mistress creation. If you're enjoying these, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment to your heart's delights, share with your friends, post it on your fridge, send it to your loved ones, pets, annoying neighbors, and social media groups. I really love to get engaged with my audience. I mean, it's my only chance to use the word engage, so what the hey. As I mentioned, I want to thank my Patreon patrons, David Batan, Roger Wyatt, David Clark, and Sharon Romero. If you want to contribute, subscriptions start for as little as $3, and just click the link in the description, and as soon as I start up to get a few more subscribers, you'll have access to exclusive content. Meanwhile, remember to look back, see if you've missed anything, and check in regularly for new content. This is Claire, and I am the Warbird Mistress. Take care.